Clara Hensley had always felt like a bird in a gilded cage. Born and raised in the small Appalachian town of Fairview, Virginia, she knew every winding dirt road, every creaking porch, and every neighbor's peculiar habit. Life here moved at the pace of the seasons, slow and predictable. Spring brought the scent of wildflowers and fresh rain, summer the heavy heat and buzzing cicadas, fall the crimson leaves and apple harvests, and winter the quiet hush of snow blanketing the hills. To some, this rhythm was comforting. To Clara, it felt confining. She had grown up in a house that was too tidy, with walls lined with books she rarely read, and a garden her mother meticulously tended. Her father, a retired school teacher, encouraged curiosity but warned her constantly to think like a woman, act like a lady, and marry a man who keeps his word. It was good advice, he said, but to Clara it felt like a set of invisible chains she had never asked to wear. By the age of 24, Clara had earned a reputation in Fairview as bright, independent, and some whispered unsettled. She worked at the local library, a modest brick building that smelled perpetually of dust and cedarwood polish. She loved the smell, the quiet, the orderly rows of books that promised worlds far larger than the one she lived in. But when the workday ended, she would wander into the woods behind her home, letting the silence and the trees speak to her in ways no human could. The mountains were her sanctuary, a place where the weight of expectation lifted, and her imagination could run wild. Despite her independence, Clara felt the tug of loneliness more acutely with each passing year. Many of her friends were settling down, marrying and starting families. Their lives, full of babies' laughter and church socials, seemed cozy and complete, but Clara couldn't summon the same desire. She longed for adventure, for mystery, for a love that didn't come packaged in polite conversation or small-town approval. She wanted a life that might scare her, the kind of stories she could tell her grandchildren about. Not a series of predictable afternoons in the library or at the local cafe. And yet, despite this longing for something more, Clara remained tied to Fairview. She loved her home, the familiar scent of pine after rain, the way the river shimmered at dawn, and the old wooden bridge near the edge of town where she often sat, dangling her feet over the rushing water. She knew she was meant for something bigger, something wild and unpredictable, but for now, she had to find ways to feel alive within the boundaries of her world. It was on one such morning, standing on the wooden bridge and watching mist curl over the river, that Clara first thought of the man no one wanted, Eli, a mountain man, they said. A hermit, strange, dangerous maybe, or at least difficult. He lived alone, miles into the forest where the trees grew tall and unyielding, and he had no family, no town ties, no interest in their Sunday potlucks or county fairs. Most people avoided him entirely, whispering tales about his supposed rudeness or wild temperament. But to Clara, the very idea of someone so utterly unclaimed by the world was magnetic. In a town where every life felt mapped out and every heart seemingly owned, Eli represented freedom. Not reckless freedom, but the kind that came from knowing yourself, living deliberately, and existing outside the gaze of others. For the first time in years, Clara felt a spark of curiosity that wasn't fueled by books or fantasies. It was real, tangible, and it prickled at the edges of her carefully ordered life. Little did she know, her fascination would soon pull her into a story far bigger than Fairview, far more dangerous, and far more beautiful than anything she had imagined while standing on that quiet wooden bridge. Eli Walker was everything the town of Fairview whispered about, and yet nothing like what they imagined. He lived deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains, in a cabin perched on a ridge where the wind swept through pines like a restless spirit. To the townspeople, he was a figure of suspicion. A man who didn't attend church, didn't socialize, and didn't seem to care about the norms that everyone else obeyed. Stories grew like ivy around his reputation. He was dangerous, perhaps a little unhinged, they said. Some claimed he had wild eyes, others that he kept strange animals. No one knew for sure because no one went near him. The truth was simpler, quieter, and far stranger. Eli was meticulous, thoughtful, and deeply private. He had chosen solitude not out of anger or bitterness, but out of necessity. Life had not been kind to him. He had lost his parents young, raised himself among the mountains and rivers that ran like veins through the land, and had learned early on that the world was harsh and people even harsher. His cabin was a refuge, built with his own hands from timber harvested from the surrounding forest. Every plank, every beam, Every nail was deliberate, a testament to a life spent creating order from isolation. Eli's days followed a rhythm dictated by the sun and seasons. Mornings were for chores, chopping firewood, tending a small vegetable garden, mending tools. Afternoons were for exploration, checking traps, observing wildlife, or hiking along trails only he knew. Evenings were quiet, a mix of reading, whittling, and tending to projects that no one would ever see. Outsiders assumed loneliness, but Eli had a companion in the land itself, the wind, the trees, the river's constant murmur. To him, the mountains were alive, and in return he cared for them, leaving no trace of harm behind. Despite his solitude, Eli was far from cold. He had a gentleness, a subtle humor, and an intelligence that one noticed only if given the time. Yet over the years, this side of him had remained hidden. People avoided him, or worse, judged him. To the town, he was an enigma. To him, the town was a web of expectations he had no desire to entangle himself in. Their worlds finally collided one crisp autumn morning. Clara had wandered farther than usual into the mountains, following a narrow path that twisted through amber leaves. She was searching for wildflowers she had read about in a book, and unknowingly, for something or someone more. That's when she saw him. A man crouched by a stream, hands immersed in clear water, eyes focused on repairing a small fishing line. His movements were precise, patient, almost meditative. Clara stopped a few feet away, unsure whether to call out or retreat. Eli noticed her, straightening slowly, wary but not hostile. His eyes, a piercing shade of blue that seemed to reflect the sky itself, studied her for a moment before he spoke in a low, calm voice. "Lost?" Clara shook her head, though the word felt inadequate. "Exploring," she said, offering a small smile. He nodded once, returning to his task, and yet something about the brief exchange unsettled her in the most thrilling way. Here was a man entirely untethered from the world she knew, a living paradox of strength and solitude. Clara felt the first tug of curiosity that wasn't about the landscape around her, but about the person who had mastered it. Over the next few weeks, she found herself returning to that same stream. They spoke little at first, sharing the space rather than words. Gradually, however, trust grew. Eli began answering her questions, sometimes with humor, sometimes with quiet reflection. Clara realized the rumors were absurd. Eli was neither dangerous nor wild in the way people claimed. He was simply himself, unafraid, uncompromising, and utterly misunderstood. For Clara, meeting Eli was like discovering a new horizon. For the first time, she understood that life beyond Fairview wasn't just a dream. It existed raw and untamed in the mountains, and in the man who had claimed them as his home. And she had no idea how profoundly he would soon alter the course of her own story. As autumn deepened, the mountains around Fairview turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson, and Clara found herself drawn more often into Eli's world. What had begun as curiosity became ritual. She would leave the town behind, slipping along hidden trails and over rocky ridges until she reached the small clearing by the stream where Eli worked. At first, their interactions were tentative. Clara would sit on a moss-covered rock, watching Eli tend his nets, whittle a piece of wood, or check the traps he had set for rabbits and squirrels. She spoke little. He spoke even less. Words felt unnecessary. Their bond, fragile and delicate, existed in shared silences, in the way the wind rustled through the trees above them, and in the unspoken acknowledgement of each other's presence. But as the days passed, curiosity gave way to a quiet intimacy. Clara began asking questions about his life, about the mountains, the animals, and the cabin he had built himself. Eli answered slowly, carefully, as if testing whether she could handle the truth of his solitude. There was a cautious pride in the way he spoke, a deep respect for the land and its rhythms, and Clara, in turn, found herself opening in ways she never had in Fairview. She told him about her dreams, her frustrations with the expectations placed on her, the books she loved, and the sense of restlessness she carried like a secret. Yet tension lingered between them, unspoken but persistent. Clara knew the town would never approve. People whispered about Eli, painting him as dangerous or strange. If they knew she was spending hours in the mountains with him, their judgment would be relentless. She feared their voices, but more than that, she feared the uncertainty of loving someone so different, someone who had built a life entirely on solitude. Could a man so self-contained share his heart? Could she share hers without losing herself in the process? Eli, for his part, was wary as well. He had spent years alone, finding comfort and clarity in isolation. Opening up to Clara was both thrilling and frightening. He recognized something rare in her, not only curiosity and intelligence, but courage and patience. She did not recoil at the forest wildness or at his quiet intensity. She listened, observed, and respected the boundaries he had set for himself. Yet even he could not deny the growing connection between them. The way her laughter brightened the cabin's shadowed corners, the way her presence seemed to fill the spaces he had long kept empty. Their courtship was slow, deliberate, and unconventional. There were no candlelit dinners, no romantic dances. Instead, they shared quiet mornings by the river, afternoons gathering firewood, and evenings under the stars, talking about the world beyond the mountains. Occasionally, Clara would bring small gifts from town, a jar of honey, a knitted scarf, a book she thought he might enjoy. Eli accepted them with a reserved gratitude more expressive in gesture than in words. Despite the growing warmth, fear lingered. Clara worried that falling for Eli meant stepping off a cliff, leaving behind the safety of the town she knew. She feared judgment, the possibility of heartbreak, and the unknowns that came with a life so different from the one she had planned. And Eli, though less verbal about his worries, felt the pressure of history and habit. He had learned to rely on no one but himself, and now he was being asked to trust someone else with the quiet corners of his heart. Still, despite the tension, the pull between them was undeniable. The mountains seemed to acknowledge it, the wind carrying whispers of approval through the pines. In Eli, Clara saw the life she had longed for, untamed, honest, and full of quiet courage. And in Clara, Eli glimpsed a world he had only imagined in fleeting moments of hope and longing. By the time the first snow dusted the peaks, their friendship had grown into something undeniable. Both of them sensed it, a bond that might withstand the judgments of a small town, the harshness of the mountains, and the fears they carried in their own hearts. But neither spoke the words aloud yet. That confession, like a fragile seed, would take time to root in the rugged soil of their shared lives. Winter settled over the Blue Ridge Mountains like a thick, silent blanket. Snow muffled the sounds of the forest and turned the world into a palette of white and silver. Clara found herself visiting Eli less frequently at first. Icy trails and frozen streams made the journey treacherous, but the cold only seemed to intensify the warmth she felt when she finally reached him. Each encounter became a sanctuary from the predictable rhythm of Fairview, a place where life was raw, honest, and shared in its quietest, most intimate form. By now, the bond between Clara and Eli had grown beyond friendship. She could read his moods in the tilt of his shoulders, the angle of his gaze, the way his hands moved over wood or stone. He, in turn, seemed to anticipate her thoughts, offering small acts of care that were far more meaningful than words. A fire stoked before she arrived, a blanket tucked over her shoulders, a mug of hot tea prepared just the way she liked it. Their lives had begun to intertwine naturally, without the fanfare or rituals that governed other people's relationships. Yet the decision to marry was far from simple. Clara wrestled with fear and doubt. Could she leave Fairview entirely for a life in the mountains? What would her family think? Would she be able to handle the isolation, the hardships, the unpredictability of Eli's world? But beneath the fear, there was something stronger, a deep, undeniable love, and the realization that she had never felt fully alive until she had stepped outside the confines of the town she had always known. Eli's own hesitation was quieter, but no less intense. He had spent decades perfecting the art of solitude. He had built a life on independence, self-reliance, and a careful rhythm that required no compromise. Yet every time Clara appeared at the edge of the forest, bringing light and laughter into his cabin, he felt a part of himself he had long thought lost begin to return. He found himself imagining a life that included her, a future shaped not just by survival, but by connection, care, and love. Their proposal, when it came, was a reflection of their unique bond. It was not a grand gesture in a crowded space, but a quiet moment in Eli's cabin, with snow falling softly outside the window. Clara had arrived carrying a small basket of herbs and dried flowers, the scent mingling with the smoky warmth of the fire. Eli, who rarely spoke of his feelings directly, took her hands in his and simply said, "I don't want to spend another winter without you." There was no hesitation, No question of whether this was right or safe. In that moment, the decision was mutual, an acknowledgement that love sometimes demands stepping into the unknown. Word of their engagement spread slowly through Fairview, carried by whispers and cautious glances. Predictably, the town reacted with a mix of skepticism, curiosity, and judgment. Some people expressed concern for Clara, warning her that Eli was wild, unpredictable, and possibly incapable of providing a normal life. Others, jealous or fearful of what they didn't understand, muttered about foolish choices and reckless hearts. But Clara had made her decision. She had chosen a life defined not by convention but by authenticity, and she was ready to face the disapproval with steady resolve. The wedding itself was small, intimate, and entirely their own. Clara wore a simple dress she had sewn herself, and Eli wore his work clothes dusted with sawdust and the faint scent of pine. No choir sang, no preacher lectured. Instead, they exchanged vows in the quiet of the cabin, surrounded by the mountains that had witnessed their journey from curiosity to love. Each word they spoke was deliberate, weighted with sincerity and the unspoken promise of a shared life forged in patience and understanding. By the end of the ceremony, the snow had stopped falling, and sunlight broke through the clouds, casting golden light over the ridge. Clara felt a rush of exhilaration, freedom, love, and the beginning of a life that, despite its hardships, promised adventure, honesty, and an intimacy deeper than anything she had known in Fairview. In Eli, she had found not only a partner but a companion in every sense of the word, and in that moment nothing else mattered. The first weeks of married life in the mountains tested Clara in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. The cabin, though sturdy and welcoming, was small, with rough-hewn walls and a stone fireplace that required constant tending. Running water was limited, and every chore demanded physical effort: chopping wood, hauling water from the stream, gathering firewood, tending the modest garden. In Fairview, life had been orderly, predictable, and at times easy. Here, survival was a daily ritual, and Clara quickly realized that the mountains required not just strength, but patience, resilience, and humility. The mornings were the hardest. Clara would wake to the cold biting through the thin blankets and the distant howl of wind through the pines. She stumbled out of bed to start the fire, her fingers stiff and numb. Eli, who seemed perfectly at home in this environment, would move with calm efficiency, stacking wood, stoking flames, and preparing simple meals. He never mocked her struggles, but she felt the quiet weight of her own inexperience. Every task reminded her of how different this life was, how far removed from the libraries, cafes, and social routines of Fairview. Yet, as the days passed, Clara discovered a rhythm in the mountains, a cadence she had never known before. She learned to wake before dawn and appreciate the quiet moments, the sun spilling gold across frost-covered trees, the crisp air carrying the scent of pine, the soft murmur of the river as it cut through the valley below. She learned to work alongside Eli without asking for instructions, to anticipate his movements and to trust her own growing instincts. Even the physical labor, once exhausting, became a source of satisfaction. There was something grounding in creating, maintaining, and caring for a life that demanded attention and respect. The evenings were perhaps the most transformative. After chores were done, they would sit by the fire, sharing stories, reflecting on the day, and planning for the next. Eli taught her to whittle, to recognize animal tracks, to identify edible plants, and to listen to the subtle warnings of the forest. Clara, in return, shared news from Fairview, tales from books she had read, and small bits of humor and observation that made Eli laugh. An unexpected sound that warmed the cabin in ways fire could not. These quiet exchanges became the heart of their marriage, binding them together in a way that required no grand gestures, only mutual respect, attention, and presence. Social adjustment was another challenge. Clara had to reconcile the isolation with the life she had always known. No neighbors dropped by for tea. No festivals or church gatherings punctuated the weeks. The silence could be profound, even oppressive, if she let herself dwell on it. She missed the gossip, the sense of community, the shared rituals of Fairview. Yet over time, she realized the isolation had its own rewards: clarity, peace, and the freedom to explore life and love on her own terms. Despite the challenges, Clara also began to notice subtle beauty in the small details of mountain living. She learned the language of the seasons, How to read the sky, how the smell of the air predicted snow, how the songs of birds shifted as winter gave way to spring. She reveled in the tactile pleasures of her new life, the feel of wood under her hands, the warmth of the fire on her skin, the taste of fresh water from the stream. In the mountains, life was immediate, demanding and unforgiving, but it was also honest and rewarding. Eli, who had once lived a life of quiet solitude, seemed to soften in her presence. Clara saw moments of tenderness she knew the town of Fairview could never imagine. The way he paused to make sure she was warm, the care he took in preparing her meals, the gentle patience when teaching her skills she struggled to master. She realized that this man, once so misunderstood and feared, was a partner in every sense, a man capable of deep love and unwavering dedication, shaped by solitude but enriched by connection. By the end of the first month, Clara understood something essential. The mountains were not just a place she lived, they were a teacher, a mirror and a sanctuary. And in Eli, she had found not only a husband but a companion who could guide her through the wilderness, both outside and within herself. Life was harder than she had imagined, but it was also fuller, richer, and infinitely more real than anything she had known in Fairview. It was a late afternoon in early spring when Clara made the discovery that would change everything. She had been wandering through the small workshop Eli had built next to the cabin, a place she had long admired but rarely explored. The workshop smelled of pine and sawdust, warm and earthy, and sunlight poured through the high windows, illuminating the dust motes that floated lazily in the air. Eli had left for the stream to check traps, leaving her alone with the quiet, the tools, and the hum of her own curiosity. Clara had been tidying the benches when something at the far end of the workshop caught her eye. It was covered by a canvas tarp, the edges frayed and softened from years of use. She hesitated for a moment, a small thrill of anticipation and nervousness prickling at her. Slowly she pulled back the tarp, revealing a finely crafted wooden cradle. Her breath caught. The cradle was unlike anything she had ever seen. Smooth, polished oak with delicate carvings of forest animals along the sides, deer, foxes, and birds, all rendered with astonishing detail. The craftsmanship was meticulous. Every curve and joint reflected hours, if not months, of patient labor. The wood itself seemed to glow in the late afternoon light, warm and alive, as if it held the mountain spirit within it. Clara's mind raced. She knew Eli had spent long hours in the workshop, but she had never imagined this. The cradle was not just a project. It was a declaration, a secret hope he had been nurturing quietly, a piece of himself he had built for someone he intended to love in ways beyond the present. She ran her fingers over the carvings, tracing the gentle lines, feeling the care embedded in every detail. When Eli returned, she was still standing there, her hands hovering over the wood as though afraid to disturb it. He looked at her, expression unreadable, until she finally spoke, her voice a mixture of awe and disbelief. You made this?" He nodded slowly, his usual reserve softened by a hint of vulnerability. "I've been working on it for a while," he admitted. "I didn't want anyone to see until it was ready." "Ready? For what?" Clara asked, her heart pounding. Eli took a deep breath, leaning against the workbench. "For a child. For our child." The words hung in the air, tender and heavy, and Clara felt a rush of emotion she had not expected. The man the town had feared, the recluse they had avoided and whispered about, had been preparing for a life filled with love, patience, and hope all along. He had imagined a future that included her and someone else, someone tiny, fragile, and completely dependent on the care of two people who would give everything to protect and nurture it. Clara felt tears prick at her eyes. I had no idea," she whispered. "I wanted to wait until it felt right," Eli said softly. "Until I knew you were ready. Until we were ready." In that moment, Clara understood the depth of his love and thoughtfulness. His solitude had never been emptiness, it had been preparation, reflection, and planning. The cradle, in its quiet beauty, was more than a piece of wood. It was a testament to his patience, his dreams, and the life he was building with her in mind. She reached out, touching his hand over hers, and he took it without hesitation. They stood together in the workshop, surrounded by the smell of sawdust and the soft glow of the late sun, holding hands above the cradle. It was as if the mountains themselves had paused, acknowledging the secret that had been kept. the promise that had been made. For the first time, Clara truly saw Eli, not the hermit, not the wild man the town feared, but the man who had quietly prepared for love, for family, for the future, and in that realization, she felt a profound sense of belonging not just to him, but to the life they were beginning to build together in the mountains. The days that followed Clara's discovery of the cradle were quiet, but charged with unspoken emotion. Every glance they shared seemed heavier, weighted with understanding and a sense of something unspoken yet profoundly felt. The mountains, which had already shaped their lives, seemed to hold their breath, as if waiting for Eli to finally explain. Clara wanted to ask questions, to hear the story from his own lips, but she also sensed that he needed the space to speak in his own time. It was a crisp morning, the kind where frost clings stubbornly to every branch and the river runs with a muted, glassy clarity. Clara found Eli in the workshop again, carving delicate vines along the cradle's edge. She watched him work, mesmerized by the precision of his hands and the quiet intensity of his focus. The silence stretched between them, comfortable yet expectant, until finally, Eli set his tools down and leaned against the bench, eyes fixed on the intricate carvings. "I suppose you want to know," he said quietly, and Clara nodded, feeling a flutter of anticipation. Eli's voice was low but steady. "I never wanted to be misunderstood, Clara. People think I live out here because I can't connect, because I'm strange. But the truth is, I've always known exactly what I wanted. I just had to prepare for it." Clara tilted her head, encouraging him to continue. "I built this cradle," he said, gesturing toward the polished wood, "because I've always hoped for a family. I've dreamed of a child, someone I could raise with care, patience, and love. But I didn't want to rush. I didn't want to settle for anyone or anything less than what I could give and what they deserved." Clara felt her heart tighten. She had suspected tenderness in Eli, glimpsed it in fleeting gestures, but to hear it spoken aloud was something different altogether. "I've been waiting," Eli continued, "for the right person to share that life with. Someone who understands that love isn't just words or appearances or what other people think. Someone who is willing to work, to struggle, and to build something real together. When I met you, Clara, I realized I didn't have to wait any longer." Tears welled in her eyes. The cradle, once simply a beautiful object, now carried the weight of his life's intentions, of his hopes and dreams, of the care he had put into every painstaking detail. She could see him as he truly was, a man who had chosen solitude not out of bitterness but out of love, foresight, and patience. "Eli," she whispered, her voice trembling. "All this time I thought, I don't know. I thought you didn't need anyone." "I didn't," he admitted softly. "Not until I found you." He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle, grounding. "This cradle is more than just wood. It's a promise to a child, to you, to the life I hope we'll have together. I wanted you to see it, to understand that I've been building something long before we even spoke of marriage, long before we dreamed of this life." Clara leaned into him, resting her forehead against his chest. The warmth of the workshop, the smell of sawdust and pine, and the soft light from the windows created a cocoon of intimacy. In that moment, all doubts, all fears, all the judgments of Fairview seemed to melt away. This was the truth. Eli's heart was open, his intentions pure, and his love profound. They stood together in silence, hands entwined over the cradle, each taking in the enormity of what had been revealed. Clara realized that love, in its deepest form, wasn't always immediate or obvious. Sometimes it was built quietly with patience and care, hidden in plain sight until the moment it was ready to be shared. And as she looked into Eli's steady, honest eyes, Clara felt an overwhelming sense of belonging, not just to him, not just to the mountains, but to the life they were creating together. A life rooted in trust, respect, and the quiet power of love that had been growing long before either of them had fully understood it. The days after Eli revealed the cradle felt different, as though the mountains themselves had shifted slightly in recognition of their truth. Clara moved through the cabin and surrounding forest with a sense of quiet awe. Everything she saw, the frost-dusted pines, the rushing river, the tiny cabin where they built a life, was now imbued with meaning. She realized she had never truly understood the depth of Eli's heart, or the care with which he approached life, until she had glimpsed the cradle and the dream behind it. Trust, Clara discovered, was not instantaneous. It grew slowly like a sapling pushed up from the forest floor, nourished by patience, attention, and time. In Eli, she saw a man who had spent years constructing not just a cabin, but a life capable of love, capable of holding another human being safely and tenderly. The cradle had revealed the careful, deliberate person beneath the rough exterior, and she found herself letting go of fears she hadn't realized she carried. Fear of isolation, fear of judgment, fear of loving someone so different. Her days began to shift subtly. She woke earlier, not out of obligation but in rhythm with the mountains. She chopped wood and carried water with a sense of purpose, appreciating each task as a way to participate in the life Eli had built. Where she had once felt inadequate or out of place, she now felt capable and connected. The cabin no longer seemed small or confining. It was a space of shared creation, a home built for a life of care and devotion. Eli noticed the change, though he rarely commented. He allowed her space to grow into this new life, offering guidance only when needed and never belittling her efforts. Slowly, Clara began to trust him in ways that went beyond admiration or affection. She trusted his judgment in survival, his instincts in the forest, his care for her well-being, and most importantly, his capacity to love deeply and consistently. One evening, after a long day of clearing trails and tending the garden, Clara sat by the riverbank, the golden light of sunset reflecting off the water. Eli joined her quietly, handing her a cup of tea without a word. She felt the weight of their shared experiences, the laughter, the mistakes, the challenges overcome, and realized that trust was not just a feeling but an action, demonstrated every day in the way they moved through life together. "Do you ever think about what life might have been like if we hadn't met?" Clara asked softly, watching his reflection ripple in the water. Eli shook his head, smiling faintly. "No, I don't dwell on what might have been. I focus on what is, on what we're building together." She smiled back, feeling warmth flood through her. It was in the mundane, in the repetitive tasks, in the quiet moments by the fire that she understood the depth of his devotion. She trusted him not because of promises or words, but because of the life he had shown her, a life grounded in patience, consistency, and deliberate care. In the following weeks, Clara's trust deepened further as they prepared the cradle together. She sanded its edges, helped apply the finishing touches, and even carved a small symbol of her own into the wood, a tiny wildflower on the inside panel. As she worked, Eli watched with pride and gratitude, never taking control, allowing her to shape a part of their shared dream. The cradle became a symbol not just of future parenthood, but of the trust and partnership they had cultivated together, the blending of two lives in a way that was both intimate and enduring. One night, as they sat before the fire, Clara leaned against Eli and whispered, "I've never trusted anyone like this before." Eli's hand brushed hers. "And I've never needed anyone like I need you," he said softly. In that moment, trust was no longer fragile. It had transformed into a quiet, unshakable foundation for their life together. The mountains outside were silent save for the rustling of the pines, and Clara realized that in the solitude she had once feared, she had found connection. In the man the world had misunderstood, she had found safety, love, and the courage to fully open her heart. The cradle was no longer just a secret or a promise. It was the embodiment of everything they were building together, a tangible reminder that trust, once nurtured, could create something enduring and beautiful. Spring had arrived in full force, the mountains alive with color and movement. Snow had melted into rushing streams. Wildflowers painted the forest floor, and the air carried a crisp sweetness that made every breath feel like renewal. Clara stood in the clearing near the cabin, brushing her hands against the petals of blooming dogwood, and felt a sense of belonging she had never experienced in Fairview. The world she had left behind seemed distant, almost unreal, compared to the life she was building with Eli. The cradle, now finished and polished, stood in a corner of the cabin, bathed in morning sunlight. Clara ran her hand over its smooth surface, feeling the carvings of animals and vines beneath her fingertips. Each detail told a story, not just of the child it was meant to hold, but of the love, patience, and dedication Eli had poured into it. It was more than furniture. It was the tangible expression of a life carefully constructed with hope and intention. Eli entered the cabin quietly, carrying a bundle of firewood. He placed it by the hearth and glanced at the cradle, then at Clara, His eyes softened with the familiar warmth she had grown to rely on, the same warmth that had drawn her into the mountains and into his world. "You've done it again," Clara said, her voice light but full of affection. "Even after all this time, you surprise me." Eli smiled, setting down the last log. "I only hope it's enough, that it can hold the life we've imagined." Clara crossed the room and took his hand, feeling the rough calluses and the steady strength in his grip. "It's more than enough," she said softly. "Because it's not just the cradle. It's you, it's us. Everything we've built together." He pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers, and for a long moment, the quiet cabin was filled with nothing but the sound of their breathing and the distant murmur of the forest. In that intimacy, Clara understood something profound. The mountains had not been a prison, the isolation not a hardship, and the whispers of Fairview not a warning. They had all been preparation. They had shaped her, molded her patience and courage, and brought her to a man who understood love in its deepest, most enduring form. Life in the mountains was still hard. There would be long days of work, harsh winters, and challenges that tested both body and spirit. But Clara no longer feared them. She had learned to trust, to adapt, and to embrace the unpredictability of a life built on authenticity rather than convention. And she had learned, more importantly, that love, when nurtured patiently and honestly, could become the foundation for everything. Over the following weeks, Clara and Eli continued to settle into their life together. They prepared the cabin for a new season, planted vegetables in the garden, and walked the trails hand in hand, talking about the future. Each moment was imbued with shared purpose, the quiet joy of partnership and the anticipation of the family they hoped to create. Clara's fear of judgment faded, replaced by pride in the life they had carved out with their own hands. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridges, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Clara sat by the cradle and whispered a small prayer of gratitude. Not just for the child who would one day rest there, but for the journey that had brought her to this place, for the man who had revealed the depth of his heart in such a tangible, enduring way, and for the mountains that had taught her resilience, trust, and love. Eli joined her silently, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. They gazed at the cradle together, their hands intertwined, hearts aligned. In that moment, Clara knew the life they were building was exactly what she had dreamed of. Not safe, not conventional, but profoundly, irrevocably theirs. The town of Fairview, with its whispers and judgments, seemed a distant memory. Here in the mountains, Clara had found freedom, love, and belonging. The cradle, finished and waiting, was no longer just a symbol of the future. It was proof that patience, trust, and quiet devotion could create something enduring and beautiful. And together, they were ready to fill it. Summer had settled over the Blue Ridge Mountains, turning the forest into a tapestry of green, gold, and wildflower colors. The air was warm, alive with birdsong, and the river sparkled under the midday sun. Clara stood in the cabin doorway, holding a basket of freshly picked herbs, and paused to take in the view. Every ridge, every tree, every winding trail had become part of her life, and in a way part of her soul. She had come to the mountains as a woman searching for freedom, curiosity, and something beyond the ordinary. Now she had found a home, a partner, and a future she could never have imagined in Fairview. Inside the cabin, the cradle remained at its place of honor, polished to a soft golden sheen. Clara had spent the morning rearranging the small room, adding blankets, hand-sewn pillows, and a tiny mobile of carved forest animals Eli had gifted her weeks ago. The cradle, once a symbol of hidden dreams and patient hope, now seemed to pulse with promise, a promise of life, of family, and of love realized in tangible form. Eli returned from checking the traps, his hands dusty with soil and a faint scent of pine lingering on his coat. He paused when he saw Clara by the cradle, and a quiet smile spread across his face. "It's ready," he said simply. Clara turned to him, her eyes shining. "Not just ready," she said softly. "Perfect." He approached, kneeling beside her, and took her hand in his. "I never could have imagined it would feel like this," he admitted, his voice carrying a rare vulnerability. "I thought solitude would be enough for me. I thought I could be happy alone. But with you, with us, it feels complete." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. "It's been a journey, hasn't it? From curiosity to trust, from fear to love. I never would have believed I could feel this at home anywhere, let alone here, in the middle of the mountains. The cabin was quiet except for the soft creak of the floorboards and the whisper of the wind outside. It was a calm, almost sacred moment, the kind that only comes when life feels aligned and whole. Clara realized that the mountains, Eli, and even the long path of challenges they had faced together had all been necessary. They had shaped her courage, strengthened her trust, and deepened her love. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing day, Clara felt the mountain's rhythms settle into her very bones. She rose with the sun, worked alongside Eli, and found joy in the simple tasks that sustained their life. The isolation she had once feared now felt like a sanctuary, a space where she could grow, love, and imagine a future unbound by the expectations of others. And then, one golden morning, the mountains delivered their next miracle. Clara awoke to the soft cries of a newborn, tiny and perfect in the cradle Eli had built. The moment was quiet, intimate, and sacred. Eli held the child gently, awestruck as Clara watched with tears streaming down her face. Years of patient dreaming, of solitude, of careful preparation had led to this, a life made tangible in the warmth of their child's first breath. Eli looked at Clara, his eyes brimming with emotion. "We did it," he whispered. "Together." Clara reached out, taking both of their hands in hers. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady despite the tears. "Together." The cradle, once a secret, had become a vessel of hope, love, and new beginnings. In its curves and carvings lay the story of a man misunderstood by the world, a woman who dared to follow her heart, and the life they had built in the mountains, a life rooted in trust, patience, and devotion. As the sun poured golden light through the cabin window, Clara knew that everything she had sought, freedom, adventure, love, family, was here in this cabin with Eli, and in the mountains that had witnessed their journey. She leaned over the cradle, smiling down at the tiny life nestled within, and whispered, "Welcome to the world, little one. This is home." Outside, the mountains stood silent and eternal, guardians of a life patiently built, a love fully realized, and a family beginning its first chapter. For Clara and Eli, and for the child in the cradle, the world was wide and full of possibility, and they were ready to meet it together.